Your personal life more important than installation. I'm sorry. I don't like this.
Like my husband.
The world and me. Wow.
I'm sorry.
To be honest.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know, is this necessary? Can you hear me?
Camera,
The camera might be, yes. I want to welcome you all. This is the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute. And we are here today to talk about a word which you hear 10 times a day in this city, strategy. Strategy is actually, it's a Greek word, strategia. It had completely military connotations in classical Greek. It had to do with moving troops around and what generals do and don't do and all that. It did not enter Western life. It didn't become a significant term in the Latin-speaking world until the 18th century, interestingly enough. But in the East, in the Byzantine world, they used it pretty much the way we use it today. So with the appearance of the United States in 1776 and thereafter, it really kind of dropped out. I recall the great lines of John Quincy Adams in his famous 1821 speech about foreign policy of the United States when he was then Secretary of State. The speech in which he said the United States does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all, but she is the champion and vindicator only of her own sovereignty and independence. In other words, there's no need for strategy. That's the whole point. And therefore, it's only really in the last generation that the word strategy has come to have such heavyweight meaning in this city. In Europe, it's a different story because beginning in the 18th century, and especially after Napoleon, the word strategy seemed, because of its link with military and so forth, it seemed to have a lot of real significance. And so you have big strategic thinkers popping up all over Europe, like obviously Bismarck was one of the most well-known and brilliant of them, but there were many others. Now, why do I mention this? Because we're here to discuss a paper which Svante Cornell is going to speak about, and it is about Europe's new strategy toward Central Asia. And the very fact that they call it a strategy is very revealing, it's very interesting. And the question then comes back, and maybe we could return to this theme at the end, is there an American strategy, and is it appropriate for there even to be an American strategy if you begin with from the position of John Quincy Adams, as I cited earlier. These are big questions. Big strategy. Is Central Asia part of a big European strategy? If so, how? And how has this changed very recently with the introduction of the new strategy? So, with this long-winded introduction, I want to get you thinking about strategy as such. That's the point. Let's turn to Dr. Svante Cornell, who carries a European passport and therefore is eminently qualified to address this topic.
let me go over here. Thank you. This is not even a microphone. Okay, I'll put one of these on the table. That should do it. Thank you very much. Like Professor Starr said, this is a discussion about, if you will, the subject of the strategy, but more broadly about the shift or emergence, I would say, of European policy, not only strategy but policy towards Central Asia. And the release of this strategy this summer is in a way a good time to take stock of the EU's role in the region. And I say this because when the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute was founded more than 20 years ago, I don't think there was any event about European role in Central Asia. I think the first one that talked about any European role was when we had then EU Special Representative for the Caucasus, Mr. Semneby, speak. That must have been about 10 years ago, about a EU role in that region. Of course, in the late 1990s, there was an American role in Central Asia and the Caucasus. It grew rapidly from the support for the Baku-Ceyhan pipeline and the broader energy industry to the all activities in the region after September 11, to support for what was going on in Georgia after the Rose Revolution and so on. Of course, today we have quite a different situation, I would say, where the US embarked on a certain disengagement with the region sometime in the late George W. Bush administration, which really has been going on ever since, although it seemed that in the early days of the Trump administration that there were signs of a rediscovery or a reassertion of interest for Central Asia, but in the past year or more we have seen very little follow-up to that. That in a way makes the role of the EU in Central Asia even more important, because it is, if you talk about Western presence in the region as a whole, by default the question what the EU is doing, if anything, becomes more relevant in the perspective of what the US is not doing anymore. Now, what we argue in this paper is that, of course, we all know about the weaknesses of the European Union on the international scene. We know about its internal troubles, especially the Brexit saga, the excessively bureaucratic form of decision-making in the EU, which I guess in a way this strategy is an example of. And obviously, in a region such as Central Asia, most importantly, the absence of hard power as an instrument for the European Union. But all of that being said, a closer look at the evolution of EU policy and also at the strategy documents that have been since 2002 as the basis for this policy leads us to conclude that the EU has, in a certain sense, made up for many of its deficiencies by a very systematic approach and an incremental and predictable growth of its presence in the region, including, especially in the last several years, graduating to having a considerable high-level attention to Central Asia, including travels by the highest level EU officials, which, for example, we don't see in the United States. So I'll quickly talk about the evolution of the EU approach over time, and then really focus on the main issues that I think the EU role and implicitly or explicitly this new strategy confronts. Now, one point that is in the paper might seem trivial or maybe even irrelevant, but it might actually be more relevant than it seems, which is that the EU and Central Asian states are actually, they share a similarity. And that similarity is that they're both products of the end of the Cold War. The EU, of course, is created as a result of the end of the Cold War from the European Economic Community, and has in the past 30 years worked to develop its internal institutions, and in many ways that is exactly the story of the Central Asian states, which of course became independent in 1991 and have also spent 30 years strengthening their internal institutions. This is not entirely irrelevant because it also shows how, as they have both grown as actors, as institutions, the EU and Central Asia have also improved the prerequisites for being able to interact with one another. If you look at the EU side of things, there are several factors that have led to the growth of EU interest in the region, and I think you can name 4 or 5 of them. Really starting only after about 2000 or 2001, with the military campaign in Afghanistan after 9/11 really being, although the EU as such was not involved, the EU countries were also part of NATO and part of this military operation. And this forced European countries more broadly to take a greater interest in the region around Afghanistan. Soon after that, the enlargement of the EU to include countries that had been part of the Soviet Union and, of course, the Warsaw Pact and had an understanding for the situation in Central Asia and an interest in that region also played an important role. A few years after that, the increasing troubles in EU-Russian relations, particularly in energy security issues, led to an interest in Central Asian energy. And more recently, of course, and explicitly, you could see the rise of China and transportation links across Central Asia to and from China being an important factor in growing EU interest, and I come back to that. At the same time, this is, on the geopolitical level. Equally important is the institutional development within the EU. I won't bore you with this, but obviously, until 1997, the EU did not have a high representative who was responsible for foreign affairs. There was, from 1997, a high representative, but also in parallel, an external commissioner for external affairs in the EU. So there were two. It was a two-headed eagle, if you accept the analogy. And only until the Lisbon Treaty in 2009, only with the Lisbon Treaty in 2009 was it consolidated into a single position of the long title of the High Representative and Vice President, who is in charge of EU foreign policy, and also for the first time had a dedicated body, the External Action Service, to implement this policy. What I'm trying to say, I guess, is that the EU only gradually during this period acquired the legal personality and the institutions and the acceptance of its member states to play an independent role as a power on the international scene and not just as a coordinator of its individual member states. You can also see how the EU began to think, and you talk about this strategy, there are many more strategies. The 2003 EU security strategy was the first attempt of the EU to explore, if you will, its role in the world. You then have, in 2016, a global strategy for the European Union. And more recently, and more also relevant to Central Asia, is the EU-Asia Connectivity Strategy of 2018 that was really launched, I guess. The word Belt and Road is not mentioned in this document, but it's very clear that this was a reaction to the Chinese BRI and how the EU should deal with it. All in all, these building blocks show a shift in the EU approach to the world, but very importantly, I think it's very clear that Central Asia has a place, a dedicated place in the EU thinking about the world. Now, equally important, I guess, is a question from the Central Asian side, why they should care about the European Union. I mean, the EU might have strategies about this and about that, but if the EU is not perceived as a relevant factor in Central Asia itself, then we don't necessarily need to be here. But I think the problem, of course, from the outset is that for Central Asian states with a very traditional hard power environment, if you will, the question what exactly the European Union is has long been, I think, quite a problematic one. It's not really a state, it's not really an international organization, and what does it really mean for us in Central Asia? How can we relate to the EU? Will they be a player on the geopolitical level, or are they just, an aid donor, or is it something in the middle? Of course, as I noted, the EU has been changing over this period, and I think you see increasingly the EU adapting to the reality that it has to deal with a world that is based on realpolitik the way perhaps they did not intentionally intend to, and that makes the EU more relevant to Central Asia. But beyond this, of course, the main role of the EU is to play the role that many other powers play in terms of helping Central Asian states achieve the balance that they are creating between the great powers surrounding them. Of course, as we all know, they are stuck between China and Russia, and they desire as much as a presence of foreign powers, be that Japan, the United States, or anybody else, to balance, to help their multi-vector policies become feasible and be realized. And the EU obviously is has an important role from a Central Asian perspective in this. Finally, I think, especially in the past 2 years, there is a specific issue in which both the EU and the United States become more interesting for Central Asian states, which is as countries like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan embark on reform efforts domestically, you can't necessarily look to Beijing or to Moscow to help you with domestic reform. If you want to make your government service more effective, more responsive to the population, if you want to create a listening state, as President Tokayev recently spoke about, well, then really the inspiration must come from somewhere else, and it's really only from the West and countries like Japan that you could really that you could really expect that type of assistance and partnership. Now, I won't list here all the details of the strategic documents that the EU has adopted over the years, but I'll just note that this strategy is by far, it's not the only document. It really started off in 2002 with what was an assistance strategy for Central Asia. There was an EU-wide strategy released in 2007. It was then formally reviewed twice because the Council of the European Union every 2 years seems to meet and to discuss Central Asia, very punctually in May or June every 2 years. And twice this 2007 strategy was reviewed, and it was found that only minor tweaks were needed to it, but the strategy itself was standing, until in 2017, or rather 18, the EU Council decided that now was the time for a new strategy. I think in large part as a result of a feeling in Brussels and in member states that the situation in Central Asia had shifted considerably in a positive direction, but also that the situation surrounding the region, especially the rise of China, warranted a new approach to the region. What I will say is that the strategy that was developed in 2019, the main difference, I would argue, is that it was a much more upbeat than earlier ones. Especially some of the earlier documents have been relatively gloomy about political development and economic development in Central Asia, and even about, you see, for example, in the 2012 review of the strategy is very gloomy about the risk of imminent spread of the conflict in Afghanistan to Central Asia after the Obama withdrawal would be completed, and so on. You see some catastrophizing, you see a lot of gloom about the region, but you don't really see that in the new document. You see formulations such as the strategy taking its basis in the long-standing ties and mutual interest of the EU and Central Asian states. It talks about an unprecedented level of cooperation between them. It talks about new opportunities from reform processes and momentum for regional cooperation in Central Asia. And I think that all also shines through the entire document, that there's a sense that there's opportunity. Central Asia is not a region of only dangers and challenges, but also very much one of opportunities for contributing both to a positive development in the region, but also to EU interests as a whole. Now, and one of the recurrent criticisms of the EU strategies is that they try to do too much. There are too many headings, there are too many details, and the EU is trying to do everything with limited resources. And I guess the new strategy has tried to follow many themes under fewer headings, is the way I would put it. They haven't really done away with anything, they've just tried to consolidate them into shorter headings with titles that I think probably some marketing agency or advertisement agency received significant amounts of money to develop, because the three titles are Partnering for Resilience, Partnering for Prosperity, and Working Better Together. Now, you might wonder what all that means, as I did when I first see it, but I'm sure some advertising specialists would be able to tell you that this is how you should package things nowadays. Under this, however, I think the real priorities that have been there for years and years remain. Very little has been removed. The change really, I think, is the addition of a cross-cutting, as they call it, priority, which is the support for regional cooperation in Central Asia, something, of course, which the EU sees itself as very well placed to support, given its own being the perhaps primary example of regional, it's not even regional cooperation anymore, it went beyond regional cooperation, but still. Other than that, I think the real shifts are really differences in emphasis, where there is a greater focus on counterterrorism, for example, and there is also, in what is a thinly veiled swipe at the Chinese presence, what they call support for sustainable connectivity, where obviously as we know, the BRI and the way China invests and the way China finances is not seen to be sustainable by Western powers and international financial institutions, and I think this is where the EU wants to play a role. There is obviously also the bilateral dimension still remaining, with the EU building its bilateral relations on negotiating enhanced partnership and cooperation agreements with the different Central Asian states. what is done with Kyrgyzstan, with Kazakhstan, and is now finishing negotiations with, or actually probably did finish with Kyrgyzstan, and is negotiating with Uzbekistan and others. But instead of going through the strategies, let me talk about some of the main issues that I think both the EU strategy, but more importantly overall EU policy or EU relations with Central Asia confronts. And these are issues like scope, I already mentioned, how to deal with the regional versus bilateral dimension, the issue of focusing on norms versus interests, which is always a controversial one in Europe, and how to deal with the fact that you're in a geopolitical environment for an organization that was not built for geopolitics, but built on the idea of shared norms rather than traditional political balancing. Now, on the scope issue, I already covered this. There is, I think, going back to your point about what a strategy is, this document is more of a hybrid between a strategy and a laundry list of various initiatives. And I think that's typical for what people call strategies today, not necessarily following perhaps the original intention of the term. On the regional approach, I think it's important to go over, if you go over the history of EU involvement and also of the criticism of EU policy in Central Asia, the EU's insistence on a regional approach to Central Asia has very much been targeted this criticism. It was criticized for applying a regional approach to countries that really are not, to disparate countries that don't really have much in common, that don't really are very connected with one another. This is a recurrent criticism. And at some point, you find even in one of the strategies reviewed back in as recently as 2015, the sense where the authors of this review say, well, you know, all the other powers are really dealing with Central Asia bilaterally. Why should we continue to deal with them on a bilateral basis? Now, this was published just weeks before John Kerry went on his trip to the region and kind of rekindled through the C5+1 initiative, at least in theory, the US approach to Central Asia as a region. But I think it's interesting to see that there was a lot of questioning about this, but on the whole, the EU continued to maintain a regional approach to Central Asia in spite of all the criticism, which of course I think has become vindicated today, with especially as we stand here a few days after the second meeting of Central Asian presidents, in which all 5 this time participated, that the Central Asian states clearly see themselves as a region, and if powers like the Russians or the Chinese prefer to deal with them bilaterally, that is of course because it gives them a greater advantage as larger powers to divide and rule among Central Asian countries rather than to treat them as a region. And that doesn't not necessarily mean that well-wishers of Central Asia, such as the United States or the European Union, should follow that approach. The other question is what the region is. Here, of course, we see continuously a focus on the Soviet-era definition of Central Asia. And I think, if anything, that's where you would criticism of the EU approach would be more warranted. But even here we see a shift, and I think in the latest document you see this much more than in earlier documents that hardly mention the Caucasus, may have mentioned Afghanistan in passing, but presently there is much more of an understanding that these Soviet-era boundaries are gradually not becoming necessarily irrelevant, but that they are not necessarily what you should maintain your focus on. And especially, I know for a fact that in Brussels there is, in the programming for the aid that is going to start for 2021 and forward, there is a strong effort to do what's never been done before, which is to coordinate, you would think somebody would have thought about it, but they haven't, which is to coordinate aid assistance to Central Asia with assistance to Afghanistan, and seeing where synergies between what's happening in those policies, of course, which unlike in the US government are in different bureaus, because Central Asia has been treated as part of the Europe and Eurasia Bureau, and Central Asia has been part of the Asia Bureau in Europe, unlike in the United States. And therefore, you know, people are on different floors, they don't necessarily talk to each other in bureaucratic organizations, and that's been really a problem, I think. And similarly, although in some strategy reviews a few years ago, there was even, maybe you could see this as an example of how the EU works, they suggested that to add the inclusion of a treaty between the EU, Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan on the creation of a Trans-Caspian pipeline. Now, that might not necessarily be how pipelines are developed in the modern world, Actually, that's probably more akin to the Soviet or Chinese way of making infrastructure projects happen, rather than a market-based approach. But this is, nevertheless, you could see this idea of linking Central Asia with the Caucasus from a European energy security standpoint. And I think increasingly you're also seeing, because of a shift in how the Eastern Partnership is being implemented. It was initially supposed to be a one-size-fits-all approach with deep comprehensive free trade agreements and association agreements. Now we see that some countries have opted for this, like Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, but others, like Armenia and Azerbaijan, have not. So if you already have an Eastern Partnership that has disparate levels of engagement with the EU, well, what's really the difference between the way Kazakhstan approaches the EU through its enhanced partnership agreement compared to the way Azerbaijan is approaching the EU? And therefore I think the hard line that in a way the EU draw in the Caspian Sea when it created the Eastern Partnership and included the Caucasus but not Central Asia might actually slowly be dissolving. And we see more of an understanding of the commonalities between these regions rather than only their differences. Let me move to the issue of how the EU deals with norms versus interest, because this, if anything, has been, not that you may have been part of this storm in a water glass, as you could call it, but this has been the major criticism in the European think tanks and academics, and the way they have approached EU policy in Central Asia is exactly that. To criticize the EU for rhetorically putting the promotion of democracy center stage, but meanwhile, to essentially ignore it for the sake of its self-interest. Now, that criticism is not one that only the EU finds leveled against itself. We find this in the United States as well. And I think if you unpack this, you find that this criticism really doesn't hold water for two reasons. Or alternatively, you can say it depends on your perception of what democracy assistance should be about. Well, the first thing is that if you go through both EU documents, statements, and actual policy over the past 20 years, you find that the EU never really bought the activist approach to Central Asia. There is, across many of these documents from 2002 onward, a clearly stated and overtly stated understanding that this is a long-term approach. This is not something that's going to happen overnight. And that the promotion of democracy and the rule of law is not going to happen through immediate political change, but through a long-term building of the prerequisites for democratic change, namely poverty eradication and institution building. Again, like I said, this has been the major focus of criticism against the EU's policy, but this is one in which they have simply not budged. There has not been any shift, if you will, into a more activist, coercive approach to democracy promotion in Central Asia. And if you take that approach, or accept for the sake of the argument the EU approach that the focus is on building the prerequisites of democracy rather than engaging in coercing these countries into immediate democratic transformation, well then things come into a different light, because then you see that the EU actually spends about 65 to 70% of the very significant monies it has allocated for Central Asia towards the goals of poverty reduction and institution building, and not to things that you would classify as self-interest, namely the promotion of energy projects or security cooperation, which only take about 25 to 30% of the EU spending. So, if the argument is, or let me put it this way, if the assessment of the EU's policy will depend on your definition of what democracy promotion means. If you mean aggressive, coercive promotion of political change with direct conditionality imposed upon recipient countries, you will be disappointed. This has definitely not been the EU approach. On the other hand, if you accept or concur with the notion that a measured and cautious long-term promotion of the prerequisites for sustainable democracy is in order, then you will find that the EU is putting its money very much where its mouth is. On the issue of how a self-proclaimed norms and based organization deals with the geopolitical environment, I think there is a serious question, which is, as many authors, including, I think, Robert Kaplan in his book about Marco Polo's world, he mentions how former empires such as Russia, China, Iran, Turkey seem to once again behave as empires that do pretty much what they can get away with, and not which is very different, and that's what's happening on the Eurasian continent. Whereas obviously the whole idea of the EU, built in the euphoria after the end of Cold War, was very much the opposite, that we now have a system based on rules, norms, international law. So how does the EU relate to an environment where you don't really have a rules-based environment anymore? You have an environment that strong countries, big countries do what they can get away with. I think this is a problem that I don't think has been resolved, or that this strategy obviously does not resolve. The answer, I think, is that the EU, on the one hand, has to adapt to the hard power reality that it is operating in. And that's obviously not just the Central Asian issue. That's very much on their own border as they deal with Russia. That's also in terms of they deal with China in the future, bilaterally. But it's definitely true in Central Asia. At the same time, the EU doesn't have the ability or even the interest of the EU to become a traditional hard power actor. Now, obviously we see Mr. Macron and others talking about how the EU has to defend itself and invest more in security since it doesn't necessarily know if the United States is there as it used to be or cannot be taken for granted. And that, at the end of the day, is probably a good thing. On the other hand, this is very much something that's going to take a very long time if the EU is ever to develop a hard power capability of its own. So in the interim, it seems that the EU niche has to be very much how it differs from the hard power actors on the Eurasian continent. And that's I think, even if the EU would miraculously follow Mr. Macron's suggestions, it's unlikely that it would be able to, in Central Asia, compete with Russia, China, or for that matter with the United States in terms of hard power. But unless, the argument we put forward in the paper is that unless the EU is prepared to adjust policies to take into consideration the reality that Central Asian states live in an environment where sovereignty is very much a focused issue. It's nothing that they can take for granted, the way the EU might have assumed some time ago. That statehood and security are the center of the minds of their counterparts in Central Asia. If they do not adapt to this reality and find a way to contribute to these concerns of the Central Asian states, the EU will not be able to increase its relevance in the region. In sum, the EU can no longer rely on the power of what it would call its normative values, but it must act more as a power, not just an integration project, especially in an area as Central Asia that is not even part of that integration project in any way. The final point I'd like to make regards what I already mentioned, namely high-level attention. The timing of the strategy is quite significant in this regard because it comes at the end of a EU outgoing leadership. As we know, the EU Commission and the European Parliament have all left the scene and new leaders are on their way in. And it seems from a closer look at the success of EU relations with the Central Asian states, which include things like high-level security dialogues and also human rights dialogues individually with each country of the region, including Turkmenistan, by the way, is a result of time and energy being given at the highest level of the EU institutions to Central Asian affairs. If you look at the contrast between, for example, Catherine Ashton's dealing with the region and Federica Mogherini, it couldn't be more stark. Ashton, at several occasions, handed off meetings with Central Asian foreign ministers to some deputies, not really finding that it was worth her time to meet a visiting foreign minister from Central Asia. Mogherini, for reasons that we could discuss, I don't know them personally, has taken a very different approach and has very much taken an interest and traveled repeatedly to Central Asian countries, including to the Tashkent, Samarkand conference rather, as well as going to Central Asia for meetings with the high-level security dialogue with our Central Asian partners. By the way, unlike the C5+1, which usually happens in New York on the sidelines of the General Assembly, the EU's bi-yearly meeting, or actually twice-yearly meetings with Central Asian leaders happen either in Brussels or in Central Asian states where the EU leaders actually travel there. And it's not only about Mogherini, but also Donald Tusk, the EU Commission President, who traveled to Central Asia as well, as recently as this year. Now, obviously, Central Asia is a region where we don't only have Chinese and Russian leaders visiting on a regular basis at the highest level. We also have in recent years seen tours, not only single visits to one or another country, but tours of the entire region by the Prime Minister of Japan, the President of South Korea, the Prime Minister of India, not to mention Turkish, Iranian and other leaders. Professor Starr and I were recently at the Astana Club meeting in Nur-Sultan, at which the only foreign potentate was Iranian Foreign Minister Mr. Zarif. There were no other serving, there were foreigners, but no other serving leaders. And this is an example, I think, of the reality that there is a greater interest in Central Asia by Asian and other powers. But aside from us going to Tashkent last year, we have not seen, to my knowledge, visits by American cabinet level officials, but the EU, unlike the United States, has actually begun to play this game. What we don't know is if the new leaders that are incoming into the European, both either the head of the Commission or the new High Representative for Foreign Affairs will be following their predecessors' example and continue to maintain this level of interest in Central Asia. So to conclude, we take, of course, on the basis of realistic ambitions of the European Union, we take a rather positive approach to the evolution of EU policy in the region, as you can tell from these comments. We think the particular importance are in two things. One is that the EU, through its very bureaucratic, twice yearly or bi-yearly Council conclusions on Central Asia and strategy review, very earnest, bureaucratic work. It might be, it might be a liability for the EU in many ways. But as concerns Central Asia, I think the important thing is that this allowed the EU and EU institutions to focus on Central Asia per se, not to treat Central Asia as an appendix to something else, which is, of course, the way particularly the Obama administration treated Central Asia, as an appendix to its Afghanistan policy. Depending on where you sit in a bureaucracy, you might see Central Asia as an appendix to Russia, as an appendix to Afghanistan, as an appendix to China in the future, perhaps. But the EU, through this particular approach, has maintained a focus on Central Asia itself, not as a corollary to something else. And the other part is that the EU has continued on a steadfast approach on focusing its policy in Central Asia on cooperation where it works with governments, not on or against these governments, against some of the advice of some of the member countries, including the country I come from, which would rather have had the EU work on or against these regimes rather than working in cooperation with them. But this is an approach that the EU has taken that has been quite fruitful and has had, I think, concrete results. Now, we have several minor policy recommendations in the region. We see particularly a role for the EU not only in promoting regionalism in Central Asia itself, but also in its relationship with Afghanistan as well as with the South Caucasus. We also find that there is one interesting omission, namely that in the 2007 strategy, the EU spoke about the importance of supporting secular government and what it called moderate religious traditions in Central Asia as a part of counter-extremism. This disappeared. This is nowhere to be found in the new strategy, which actually has a greater emphasis on counter-extremism and counter-terrorism. And it seems that that runs the risk of treating only the symptom of the problem, namely violent extremism, but not the underlying problem, which is the ideologies that are trying to gain a foothold in Central Asia, and which Central Asian states, thanks to their secular commitment to secularism, are well placed to counter. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's really an excellent, thorough, carefully prepared is available.
Yes.
A word about availability.
The executive summary should be on the table behind you, and the paper itself is on the Institute website.
Well, I wish all paper presentations at Washington think tanks were as coherent as this. Thank you very, very much. It's really good. Now, this leaves the floor open, and there are a lot of questions. I saw eyebrows going like this at various points. Yes, sir.
Sure. So yes.
Sure, Alex Sanchez, Gen Defense. Can you talk a little bit more about trade relations between the European Union and Central Asia? I mean, for example, Kazakhstan. I read that trade between the EU and Kazakhstan is $29 billion, which makes the European Union as a whole Kazakhstan's largest trading partner. Individually, it would be Russia and China second, but as a whole, is the EU. So what is trade relations like between the EU and Kazakhstan and Central Asia? Obviously, these governments, these countries, they want to have their relations, but they also want to sell their goods, their services to the European Union, which is a huge market. So is that expanding, is that evolving? Does this strategy address trade relations at all? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for your question. There is a lot about improvement of trade in this document. Obviously, it suffers from the liability or drawback that none of these agreements, either the one with Kazakhstan or the ones that are being negotiated, include any kind of idea of free trade or including the Central Asian states in any free trade zone, unlike the Eastern Partnership countries. That said, I think you put in your question, you put your finger on the big problem, or not necessarily a problem, but the disparity. Namely that if you look at EU trade with Central Asia, there is Kazakhstan and everybody else. And those are two different stories. That primarily, of course, the reason for the 20 billion is the oil trade. And the fact that Kazakhstani oil, much like Azerbaijani oil, goes to Europe for being refined. But also, if you look at the imports, you see similarly that it's to Kazakhstan that most of European exports to Central Asia go to the industrial sector in Kazakhstan. And that in no other country do you see the EU even comparatively at an importance for the regional trade as you see in Kazakhstan. Now, I think there is quite a good chance that if we reconvene here in several years, this will have changed. For several reasons, one being that Central Asian countries are increasingly trading with one another, which they frankly were not doing very much until very recently. And as that happens, and especially as Uzbekistan, which is by population twice the size of Kazakhstan, is opening up to trade, this will also mean that naturally trade between the EU and other Central Asian states, primarily Uzbekistan, will, I think, grow very rapidly. The question accompanying this is to what extent Central Asian states will be able to, through their own regional cooperation, appear to be a single market. Can you base yourself in one Central Asian country and work in all the five, or at least 3 or 4? Or will you need to maintain separate relations with each Central Asian country? And I think if you look at the priorities of the Central Asian leaders today, definitely the Kazakh and Uzbek leaders who have been the driving force behind regional cooperation, it's very much an economic and business-oriented approach that they're taking. Their primary goal is to acquire foreign direct investment and to develop their economies. And they understand that that requires breaking down the artificial boundaries between their countries in terms of trade that have been created. Now, to what extent they will be able to accomplish this is a different question, but the intention is definitely there.
Can I call on Ambassador Farhad Salim from Tajikistan, who maybe could give us an impression of all this from the other side?
Thank you very much. Great presentation. With regards to I have a question and a comment. You said about the trade between the countries in the region. Just one small fact that, for example, between Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, we used to trade $30 million a year. Now it's 400 plus. So this is how much it means the opening of our neighboring countries for the benefit of the entire region. And the question is now, with regards to this strategy, Any idea when the strategy of this big player is going to come up towards Central Asia?
Which one?
Because we've been waiting, the promise that it's going to be in September,
Yeah.
Now it's December.
Can I maybe call on Ambassador Hoagland, who's no longer in the State Department, but knows that issue from the inside?
Would you summarize the question for me again? I had a hard time hearing.
Where is the U.S. strategy that was promised long time ago? What's holding it up, and when will we see it?
In fact, that's one of the things I was going to mention.
Is it a statement or a question?
No, not as a question at all, because I do know about inside works on this. This administration it did put out its global national security strategy, and that's on the record. But it has been working on regional strategies, including a national security strategy for Central Asia. It's been underway for about 2 years now, I think, in drafting. It was promised, I began to follow this more closely in January of this year, so about a year ago. And I read both drafts, the classified and unclassified at that time. And of course, only the unclassified would be released. That was promised for April of this year. That came and went. So I checked again. It was promised no later than midsummer. That came and went. So I checked again. It was promised for October 20th, more precise. That came and went. So I checked again. And it is now hoped to be out by the end of the year. The problem really is much greater, I think, than this administration, although I'll do both sides of it. The problem is that, as you well mentioned and pointed out, the United States has paid attention to Central Asia and the independent states from the very beginning of their independence, but especially starting with the George W. Bush administration and the Obama administration, it became more and more backburnered. And that persists to this day. Then, specifically for this administration, it is quite honestly and frankly, I'll tell you, very hard to get policy done because increasingly people are putting their heads down and uncomfortable sending things forward or sending new ideas forward. And when this does eventually come out, the U.S. National Security Strategy for Central Asia, I am 99.5% certain that it will not be any different from the past.
Thank you very much. Let me, if I can divide the remaining time we have, I'd like to divide it into two sections. First, further questions for Dr. Cornell on this report, which is available online already. It's really very comprehensive, but if there are any further questions on that, then I'd like to turn to the other side, the literal side of the Greek side of strategy, namely the security dimension, and ask what is NATO doing in all this at the same time, because it's a relevant factor. It could affect both the United States and especially Europe. Okay, on further questions directed toward the substance of the new strategy from the EU. My goodness. Yes, please.
Thank you for your great talk. I'm Fulbright postdoc at George Washington University from Georgia originally. I have a question about this strategy. We know that when we do any international organizations like European Union or NATO, when they put some strategy up front, they have certain goals. In case of ENP countries like Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, it's clear that they need and they kind of incentivize those governments to build democracy and further membership, even though it's not clear and they don't apply this kind of clear conditionality. But what's the aim and goal in case of Central Asian region? Is it just the energy policy? Is it just the economic benefits, or it goes beyond it? Because there is no clear way to hold accountable those governments who are kind of questionable in democratic performance. Thank you.
Well, I think there are different ways of looking at this. The simplest way is perhaps to say that this is filling a vacuum. That for the longest time the EU as an institution, or you could say European states more generally, they obviously had Russia policies. Many of them had a Mediterranean policy if they were in the southern part of the EU. And everybody obviously had relations with Japan and the Far East, and increasingly everybody's mind is on China. Then again, people are realizing that India is growing pretty rapidly too. And then finally there is this block in the middle. And I think gradually what happened is, from different perspectives, from both the institutional, but also from every subject area that you mentioned, there was a growing realization that this is actually something we have to think about. We can't just ignore Central Asia. We have to have some form of approach to Central Asia that is interlinked with our approaches to China, to Russia, to South Asia, and so on. Now, if you look at what triggered the growth of EU interest in Central Asia, I think it's fairly clear that it was mainly, I would say, two things that led to this. One is the EU interests that are in terms of the transit, trade and transport with China. It is in terms of energy security with Russia, but also a sense that, if we have these troubles with the Russians, maybe it's quite useful to develop relations with the countries surrounding Russia, both as a listening post to know what's going on to the north, but also in terms of having options in our foreign policy. And then I think the other one is that there was a lot of despondency, a sense that Central Asia is a hopeless place. Nothing is going well there. There are horrible dictators and this and that. But then that started to change, and the sense in Europe gradually is, not only in Kazakhstan, of course, was a trailblazer because they launched their path to Europe already in 2008, and then they had constitutional amendments where they literally sent them over to the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe for comments and so on, and continuously prodded and approached European institutions. And then the big thing, of course, was the transformation of Uzbekistan. And I think all this together led to a sense that something's really happening here. And here's a chance to support this development, a positive development. So Central Asia became a kind of a positive story, which is what you don't see in the Caucasus, for example. So Georgia used to be the everybody's darling 15 years ago, but now everybody looks at the Caucasus and is like, what can we even do here? It's just a mess. Whereas in Central Asia, to use a word we don't usually use, but there was a narrative that developed that Central Asia, something good is happening here, both with the reform initiatives and with the regional cooperation momentum, and that there is really something that can be achieved. And I think for bureaucrats at any level, if you go to your boss and say, we should really do more and more here or there, the answer is going to be, well, what's really in it for me? That's why I think if you go to your boss and say, let's go resolve the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, people are going to say, well, no. Maybe not. Maybe I should focus on something else that's more likely to advance my ambitions or career or whatever. But in Central Asia, I think this positive notion that something was happening in Central Asia that fit into, I think, especially nowadays, the China situation and the BRI, I think that was probably the most important trigger. That was part of the answer. Then there was another part of your question that I can't seem to remember. Or maybe not.
Well, another dimension that's worth stressing is that there are bilateral relations also. And therefore, when you say, maybe their interest really is just in increasing investment in business, that may be true on the bilateral basis, and not necessarily true on the EU basis, or vice versa. And we've only talked about the EU strategy here. We haven't talked about bilateral, which is very important too. Dick, you want to Ambassador Hoagland?
I fully support that. In fact, over the past 25 years, various Central Asian countries' relations with Europe it's been the bilateral relationship that's much more important than the European Union, even though they pay lip service to the European Union. And primarily it has been UK, Germany, some Scandinavian countries, and more recently, surprisingly enough, Latvia has played a very positive role in Central Asia, even though it's very quiet.
Which is why, by the way, Central Asians pay a lot of attention to Latvia. Just our new ambassador from Uzbekistan to Latvia spent many years here in Washington, and very respected young guy.
Just this is in the paper, but the impetus for a first EU real strategy in 2007 was very much a result of Germany's discovery, if you will, of the region. It was Steinmeier who visited Central Asia in 2006, I believe, and then who really said the EU should pay more attention. Likewise, the 2015 review happened during the Latvian presidency, and they were the ones who were responsible for it. So obviously, and you see it also in some of the main European EU initiatives in the paper we speak through greater detail about this, which is that if you look at the three major initiatives, one was the Rule of Law Initiative, which I think it was France and Germany, if I'm not mistaken, who took the lead role. So even on the EU level, there are member countries constantly being encouraged to take a leadership role in actively implementing the strategy.
I'm going to stress a point that you threw out just in passing, which is intriguing, and that is the expansion of the EU eastward into Central Eastern Europe. It really has had an impact in Central Asia and the Caucasus. Just to give two examples, the current EU ambassador to Central Asia is from Slovakia, and the head of the EU's organization, the UN's organization in Turkmenistan, which deals with peacemaking and all that stuff, is from Moldova. So, you have a very prominent voice from Central and Eastern, these and other central voices from Central and Eastern Europe who weren't there on the scene before. The previous ambassador from the EU was Ambassador Morel, very competent Frenchman, but with a certain, if you will, a French cast of thought, which his successor doesn't share. Okay, can I switch to the other side, because there is the third leg of this stool, and that is the bilateral, the EU and NATO. Anyone want to offer some comments on the NATO? NATO at a certain point years ago was very active all over the place. It had bilateral relations with everyone. Really transformative impact on the militaries in several of these countries. I remember going first time to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and encountering absolutely Soviet-type military people, and even physically. Big beefy guys who sat on tables that looked like someone had been cutting like a butcher block had been used on them. It was very rough. Come back 4 or 5 years later, totally replaced by young generation guys, all of whom spoke English, each of whom had a computer parked in front of them, and they'd all been trained at the NATO training center in Germany, and so on. And then there was the famous longest deployment ever, longest distance deployment ever from a base in southwest Louisiana all the way to Kazakhstan. I think it was to Kazakhstan. Cent Azbat, the Central Asian Battalion, even existed. Now, where are we today? What's going on? Do you want to comment on that?
Yes, if I may.
Ambassador Sullivan.
Thank you very much again. Yes, I was lucky to serve in our mission to NATO back in 2003 to 2007. That activeness is not now, the case. We still have PFP, Partnership for Peace, EAPC, Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council. Each month our ambassadors gathered. That was an active phase of the NATO engagement in Afghanistan. That's why the Central Asia so kind was on the radar or on the map of the NATO. Unfortunately now the mission is over there in Afghanistan pretty much, and that's why this focus is diminishing, it's decreasing. They did in the beginning of our independence. The NATO did a great support. I mean, militarily, advisors, trainings. Even they had this magnificent project of the internet to the universities and the Academy of Science. It was a magnificent support by the NATO. But nowadays we do see this decrease, well, probably because of the internal issues in the NATO itself. But don't forget that among the 5 Central Asian countries, 2 of them are part of the CSTO, and it's another something that the NATO should take a look at.
Yes, please.
Can I follow one follow-up question?
The question is going in line with the ambassador mentioned about the membership of those Central Asian countries to the Collective Security Treaty Organization, right? And when we're talking about European Union and kind of, I absolutely support as far as European Union goes in the region, but there is also Eurasian Union. And what do you think? How compatible is EU strategy with Eurasian membership of even Kazakhstan or other Central Asian countries?
Well, I mean, I think the easiest way to answer it is to say that the only country that has an enhanced partnership by agreement with the EU is a member of the Eurasian Union and of the CSTO. So, you know, it depends on how you really approach these organizations. In the following sense, we know that every country that has joined the Eurasian Union has not necessarily done so voluntarily. And even when some countries have joined this organization, it has been announced in such a way that some members didn't know that another country was joining this organization. I'm talking about Armenia in 2000, whenever, for example. So in this sense, I think it's kind of clear that maybe the countries that actually are reaching out and need the interaction with other entities most are the ones that have, to some extent against their will, been incorporated in some of these structures of integration, that they, we hear many, both anecdotally and otherwise, how they advise other countries, don't do as we make, don't repeat our mistake, don't join this organization. So there are, of course, where it really becomes an issue is what happened, as we saw very clearly with Ukraine and with Armenia, that the idea that you could have a membership or an association agreement with the European Union and a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement is not compatible with Eurasian Union membership. I think outside of that, there are really no technical limitations. More interesting is the question of, which keeps popping up all the time, how the EU should relate to the Eurasian Economic Union. There are people within the EU, and obviously people both in Russia and in Kazakhstan and elsewhere who think that, well, maybe we have to find a way to link up the EU somehow as some form of, on a Eurasian, almost a global level, dialogues between all these organizations. And I think that's a much more complicated question because the Eurasian Economic Union is simply not an analogous to the European Union. For several reasons. One is the involuntary nature of this type of integration. The other one is that there is one country that is fundamentally in control of this organization and is driving this organization for its domestic national interest. That's not the case with the EU. The EU is a case of spontaneous, integration between consenting adults, let's say. And as we see with Brexit, whatever you want to say about Brexit, if you don't want to be part of the European Union anymore, well, then you're free to leave. And I think that's why the idea that there is some analogy between these organizations, that they should somehow be cooperating, I think is potentially problematic because that would lead to an endorsement by the European Union and endorsing an idea that somehow the Eurasian Economic Union is somehow similar to the EU.
To be a little more blunt, these are not only are they not analogous organizations, they're incompatible. There's a famous cartoon that appeared in the London Times of London during the North African campaign in World War II, in which General Montgomery and General Rommel are sitting opposite each other on a little table like this in the middle of the desert with palm trees and everything in the background. And Montgomery is looking very hard at a hand of cards, and Rommel is studying very hard chessboard in front of them. Underneath it says not playing the same game. The game of NATO is fundamentally economic and cultural. EU is fundamentally economic and cultural. The game of the Eurasian Economic Union is fundamentally political. And by the way, the language is important. Svante mentioned the possibility of leaving the Brexit gambit. In the case of the Eurasian Economic Union, the language is language of integration, and not coordination, not cooperation, which is the reigning language throughout Central Asia, but integration. The European Union is, in spite of its long history of integrative activities, these days is also functioning very much more productively, but on the area of coordination and cooperation. So these are fundamentally different, and the idea that there's equivalency is nonsense. However, every one of the Central Asian countries, not to mention the Caucasus, are under tremendous pressure. And what puzzles me is the refusal in any direct way of either the EU or the United States to acknowledge this pressure. We're pretending as if, well, we all know it exists, but it's not something polite people discuss. Anything further? Yes, sir. Two more. Yes, Ambassador Hoagland, and then return to you.
Thank you, Fred. I won't be long at all, but I just want to add a few details on the security side. You rightly mentioned, Ambassador, the issue of CSTO, Commonwealth Security Treaty Organization, headed by Russia. The thing is, at least from my distant view, is that has never proven itself yet as an effective organization, because the one time since its founding that a member state asked for specific help, which was Kyrgyzstan in 2010, Russia did not respond. So it is an organization that's out there. I admit that absolutely. But the question is, how much can it do in the future there?
Which Uzbekistan quit.
Yes, indeed, that's correct. NATO, this was touched on very briefly. There are still partnership for peace programs, but they're very small. And with each of the countries, but they're very small. Yeah, they still exist, I believe. No?
I don't know.
I think so, yeah.
Amazing.
U.S. bilateral. We have, of course, military attaches in every country. Our DoD does train and equip in every country. And then also, we have National Guard partnerships in every country. A state National Guard forms a partnership for at least annual training programs, and sometimes more than that. And then finally, we need to continue to pay attention to China and Russia doing military exercises in the region, and sometimes joint military exercises in the region. And especially China. We've been talking and touching on BRI. That's basically, BRI is soft power, but inevitably hard power follows soft power. And we're beginning